I wanted to start by asking you about the Tulsa seed study. Can you tell me a little bit about what you and your colleagues were looking at?
Tulsa Seed began in 2016 with a cohort, a sample of young kids who were 3 years old in 2016. And they were low income, and they were in center-based early care and education programs. So what's available to 3-year-olds is Head Start, community-based kind of child care centers, and a program called EduCare, which is a birth to school entry early intervention program, all low-income families. And we followed those kids from age 3 until age 4 when they entered public pre-K in the Tulsa public school system. We added some new kids into the sample who had never been in childcare to that point. And then we followed those kids, age 4 in 2017, into kindergarten in the fall of 2018, into first grade into the fall of 2019, entering second grade now in the fall of 2020.
What were you looking for?
The goal of Tulsa Seed is a study on early education and experiences, and it's looking at whether different pre-K experiences, which is why we started when kids were 3 or 4, the association between different pre-K experiences for low-income kids and their later school self-regulatory and health outcomes through 4th grade.
What did you find?
We're still really in the thick of it. I mean, you know, our study goes through 2023 when kids are expected to be in 4th grade. So far, we've looked at kind of pre-K to kindergarten associations, and we have some emerging work finding greater impacts of pre-K education when kids go to public school-based pre-K versus like a Head Start program. We're really just starting to analyze some of our data. We've done a lot of work looking at early care and education teachers' well-being and teacher stress for 4-year-old pre-K teachers, associations between teacher well-being and like classroom quality, teacher well-being, and children's outcomes.
Have you started to take a look at COVID? We've kind of got this COVID filter.
Right.
It affects everything.
So
What have you and your colleagues taken a look at specifically?
when I was laying out for you the kind of trajectory of the study, I kind of paused and I said, first grade in fall of 2019, and then what happened in the end of first grade, boom, school shut down. So all of our sample by first grade was in the Tulsa Public Schools school district. It's a large and diverse school district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And when school shut down in mid-March because of the pandemic, students moved to remote learning, as they did all over the country. So, you know, parents became teachers. Many parents lost their jobs. Teachers started teaching from home. Teachers had some of their own kids at home learning with them. So it was chaos for the parents, as you can imagine, chaos for the teachers, who themselves, many of them are also parents, chaos for the kids. So we decided to capture, since our goal was always to capture children's school experiences through 4th grade, when school became home in the end of first grade, we pivoted and we fielded a survey of parents, now that parents were teaching kids at home, and we fielded a survey of teachers' experiences post-school shutdown.
And what did you find?
We found, consistent with a lot of other data that's emerging from studies around the country, high rates of job and income loss among parents, high rates of food insecurity among parents and teachers, relatively high rates of depression, and for parents, the depression and food insecurity associated with each other. So high rates of depression went along with high rates of food insecurity and vice versa. For teachers, high rates of job-related stress. So we asked a question, did your job become more stressful when you moved to remote learning due to COVID closures? And a large percentage, 2/3 of the sample, said yes, of the teachers. So high rates of stress among teachers. About half the sample of teachers had children of their own learning at home, so they were teaching their own kids while teaching our sample kids.
You found specifically kids with some learning challenges
Yes.
had more difficulty right now. Can you tell me a little bit about
Families
that?
of children with special needs were much more likely to report challenges with distance learning. So about 8 in 10 of those families, relative to 6 in 10 of other families, reporting a hard time accessing instruction remotely.
You had mentioned an association between the high rates of depression and the high rates of food insecurity.
Yeah.
Were you guys able to determine if one was associated with the other, or why that was?
You use the right language, which is associate. Like, we can't do any causal work because they were measured at exactly the same time. But associate is exactly right. They do seem to correlate. They go together. So high rates of one go along with high rates of the other. And that's something that the general literature on food insecurity has found very consistently. So depression, particularly among mothers and households, adult households, or adults in households with children, Mother depression goes along with food insecurity. And the thinking behind that is that, not having enough food can make you feel depressed. And at the same time, struggling with depression can make it hard to plan meals and to make your food budget last. So whether food insecurity causes depression or depression causes food insecurity, we don't know, but they do go together a lot.
When we have this group of kids out of school, where they might normally receive some of these services or free breakfast, what kind of additional burden is that placing upon these families?
It's huge, and we did not, because this particular study isn't focused on food insecurity, we didn't ask a disproportionate amount of questions about that. That was one of many stressors we measured. But we know from other literature that not being able to know where your next meal is coming from, worrying about food supply, worrying about having enough of the right kinds of healthy foods to provide for your kids is very stressful for parents. So we can imagine that this only ramped up the stress that we were observing in our study here. It's also true that in Tulsa, schools did start to provide takeaway food. So families were, as we've seen in kind of news reports all over the country, driving up and picking up kind of to-go bags of food. So food was still available through the school, and in many ways schools kind of served as food access points for these families. So they didn't entirely lose that lifeline, but we can only imagine that the struggle to obtain food for their kids through school on a daily basis contributed to the stress that they were reporting.
Are there takeaways for parents?
We're not at the point yet in these data where we can estimate impacts. What is all this going to look like on kids' school outcomes? Because they've just gone back to school in the last week and a half. So we don't yet know. Now they're second graders. And they're still learning remotely. School has not opened in person yet. They are going to be doing some testing remotely, like school achievement tests. So we'll be able to look at kids' competencies in the fall and how they may have fallen behind, which is what many people suspect has happened. So we can't really answer any questions about what is the effect and therefore what can parents do to stem an effect. What we can say is that parents seem like they're doing the best they can. And reaching out and asking for help is probably going to be hugely important. So hopefully schools will make mental health services, school nurse services available so parents can use those as touch points. I didn't mention before, many parents reported increased emotional and behavioral problems among their kids. And so whether those behavioral problems are exacerbating the parent stress, whether parent stress is exacerbating the behavioral problems, we don't know. But school nurses, school counseling, school mental health resources, even over Zoom, like telehealth, can be really helpful for anchoring the family's mental health. And so if both parents and kids are struggling, my hope would be that schools make those services available remotely this fall so that families can take advantage and hopefully boost everybody's mental health.
From a policy standpoint, anything that you would want those stakeholders, those lawmakers, those policy makers to know about what you and your colleagues are finding?
I think the food insecurity finding is a big one. I think that, expanded food assistance policy is really going to be important. So not cutting, SNAP benefits, making eligibility wider. So if you are just at that income cutoff limit, maybe making food stamp benefits a little more generous. And this idea of pandemic EBT, so pandemic electronic benefits card, making cash available to these low-income families through a trackable benefits card is really important, because it seems like with the income loss, the job loss, the food insecurity, and the depression, all of those things in some ways could be maybe addressed by a little bit of infusion of income into the household.
Tell me where you go from here. I know you said your findings aren't for a while. But
the goal of the larger Tulsa Seed study, like I said, is to estimate educational, self-regulatory health effects of pre-K education by following kids every year in school, testing them, observing their classrooms, interviewing their teachers. Now that school is remote, at least in the fall, the schools have not opened in person. Our plan is to try to do their assessments potentially remotely, so we can use Zoom to administer some basic assessments of children's cognitive skills. And to still interview their teachers once the new teachers get to know them, so we can still conduct interviews with the teachers. And then, we obviously can't observe classrooms because nobody's in a classroom right now and nobody wants to be, close to other people for good reasons. But we will probably redo these COVID surveys in the fall of parents and teachers to see how much these things have changed, how much they've stayed the same, and then, how is it impacting children's development.
For people who have heard the term food insecurity, but may not have a frame of reference. Is there a good way to describe food insecurity?
Food insecurity is inadequate access to sufficient food needed to fuel a healthy and active lifestyle. So it includes, and it's food of the quantity and quality needed. So it includes access, but also like worrying about access.